Welcome to another episode of The Unseen Paranormal, where some of the scariest things are unseen. I'm your host, Eric Freeman. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Today we are chatting with UFO researcher and author Warren Agius about his brand new book, Evidence of Extraterrestrials. Over 40 cases prove aliens have visited Earth. Warren is a longtime UFO researcher known for his unbiased approach to factual evidence. You can find Evidence of Extraterrestrials on Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, or anywhere fine books are sold. Welcome to the show, Warren. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So how did you get into being a UFO researcher and writing this book?
I guess my journey started around 7 years ago when I read Jim Marrs's Alien Agenda book. When I read that book, it completely opened my mind. And I couldn't believe that these events and these phenomena were actually happening. I had thought that UFOs were about bright lights in the sky or green little men. But after reading that book, I realized that it was far deeper than that. It was about an international cover-up. It was about advanced technology and advanced civilizations. So that book practically gave me a different perspective on a phenomenon that I really did not know anything about. After that, I started doing my own research, but I quickly realized that there's a lot of misinformation out there on the internet. And that is when I promised myself that when writing this book, I would only include information which is factual. So that's how I got the information for the book. But Jim Marrs was completely the reason why I started reading and researching the phenomenon.
I love the way you start out the book with explaining the different contacts with UFOs and aliens. And can you kind of explain what the major ones are? Because people have heard like movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but I don't think people really know what those terms mean.
So over the years, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who is, for those listeners who do not know who Hynek is, he was basically an American astronomer, but also an advisor for Project Blue Book, which was a government-funded project to investigate UFOs. So Hynek realized that there were multiple reports, but these reports were different in nature. So what he did is that he started grouping these reports, and he basically came up with around 9 categories which describe a UFO report. So each and every UFO report would fall under one of these categories. In the book, I cover mainly the first 3 levels. So in the first level is called nocturnal lights, and these reports would include lights in the sky. So this would include bright lights in the sky, such as the Phoenix lights. In the second level, Hynek talks about the daylight discs, and this usually refers to sightings which were made in the daytime. And he then realized that there was a common denominator between these reports, and that these reports all described a disc-shaped aircraft. So all those reports, which include disc-shaped aircraft, cigar-shaped aircraft, would fall under this category. And finally, there is the third level, which is known as the radar visual sighting. These include sightings which not only include visual contact, but also radar contact. And to me, perhaps the third level is even more important than the first 2, because there's a difference between a visual sighting and a radar sighting. A visual sighting could easily be a misidentification of a natural phenomena, military aircraft, or a weather balloon. But if something shows up on radar, then that means that this could not be a hoax. It could not be anything but an aircraft. So if an aircraft shows up on the radar target, it proves its existence. And this is why those reports, which include radar sightings, are so significant to the UFO phenomenon, because they prove that the UFO was actually infiltrating national airspace.
Right.
But then Hynek goes on to include other levels, which I don't really talk about in the book. But just to give the listeners a brief overview, there would be the close encounters of the first kind, which include sightings in which the individual has seen an aircraft or extraterrestrial beings within close proximity. Then there would be close encounters of the second kind, in which the individual would have some sort of physical alterations caused by the UFO or the extraterrestrial beings. And then there would be the close encounters of the third kind. The movie was based around, and in this category, there is an obvious presence of an extraterrestrial entity.
Yeah, and I like how you started the book out with all of those and kind of explaining that. And then also the way that you set up the different parts of the book. There's 4 parts of the book, and it kind of is set up like an encyclopedia of different types of contact. And part 1 is modern sightings, part 2 is crashes and landings, part 3 is military pursuits, and the 4th part is all the different government projects. Why did you set the book up that way?
So in all the books that I have read about the UFO phenomenon, I really wanted to find a book which covers all the significant UFO sightings. And I really wanted a book which was clear parts of the book. I really wanted to find that for my own sake, but I couldn't find any of those ideas. So I decided to come up with this format to make it easier for the readers to see, to navigate through the book, basically. I think it makes it far easier. So if you want to read a chapter about an encounter in which military aircrafts were scrambled, you would go to part 3 of the book. If you wanted to read about Roswell, a famous crash, you would go to the 2nd part of the book, and so on and so forth. I think in this way, it makes the book much more easier to read and much easier to navigate. Even for myself personally, if I want to read up on a particular sighting, I can easily go to one of the parts of the book and then read the chapter through that, basically.
Yeah, and it's kind of set up like a reference book that way. And I wanted to read on the Amazon synopsis for your book. It says, whether you're a seasoned UFOologist or just have a casual interest in unexplained phenomena, this book reveals detailed answers to prove once for all the aliens are real and they're visiting Earth. So this definitely could become a reference book for ufologists and other researchers in the UFO phenomenon, but also, just people interested in the stories and like I said in the beginning, that you approach this, all fact-based evidence.
Exactly. And that was 100% my idea. I didn't want a book which was completely scientific and using jargon which nobody knows what you're talking about. I use simple words to describe what the phenomenon is about. And I also wanted to basically use this book as a reference for those researchers who wanted to read out about a topic, a case in point, or else about someone who has no idea what the UFO phenomenon is about, and they could pick this book up and get a brief overview of what the sightings are and what the UFO phenomenon entails.
All right, so let's get into the book a little bit. Part 1 with like the modern sightings. There are a lot of modern sightings that people are familiar with, like the Phoenix Lights, like you had mentioned, and then even back in the 40s, the Battle of L.A., and lots of really interesting stories. What were some of the most interesting that you found?
The first case which basically which caught my attention in the UFO world was the Battle of LA. It was one of the earliest reported cases, and although the report was made in 1942, there is still significant amount of evidence. There is still a significant amount of evidence. And what happened was basically 3 months after Pearl Harbor, on the 25th of February 1942, the United States Army, they started tracking an identified target on their radar. This was at around 3 a.m. And then shortly thereafter, they assumed that there was an attack. An attack was imminent. They assumed that the Japanese were about to bomb America once again. And so they sounded the air raid. And every person living in Los Angeles, there were thousands of witnesses. They came out of their house only to see a silver-shaped, disc-shaped object hovering in the sky. In the sky, there was an enormous silver disc-shaped object surrounded by smaller ones. And everyone was confused because they were expecting an attack, but instead they simply saw a bizarre-shaped object hovering in the sky completely silently, completely motionless, and just hovering there for over an hour. And to me, what proved that this encounter was extraterrestrial in origin was the fact that the army, they shot anti-aircraft shells at the UFO for an entire hour. I believe that they shot around 1,400 shells, and the aircraft was completely unaffected. So that proved that the aircraft was not Japanese in nature, nor was it a weather balloon as they had claimed later on. Because if the aircraft was Japanese, then it would have been shot down, and if it was a weather balloon, it would also have been shot down. But the disc-shaped aircraft just stood in the sky, hovering silently until it eventually disappeared. So that was the first case which basically made me realize just how powerful these beings are. Apart from that, my second favorite case would be the McMinnville photographs. The McMinnville photographs are the highest quality UFO photographs that you could find on the internet. They're completely authentic. They were investigated on numerous occasions, and yet each and every investigation showed that these photographs are completely authentic and they're not a hoax. To give the listeners a brief overview of that case, there is a couple, the Trent couple. They lived in McMinnville, in Oregon, I believe, and the wife, Evelyn, she saw a disc-shaped aircraft in the sky. But what Evelyn did is that she shouted at her husband, who immediately brought out his camera and photographed the disc-shaped aircraft. Then they sent that photograph for analysis. They submitted it to a local magazine, but the magazine stated, listen, if we're going to publish this photograph, it has to be authentic. So they sent it for investigation and analysis, and it showed that it wasn't a hoax. It was completely authentic. So I have to say that would be the second case which really proved how amazing and complex the phenomenon is.
Yeah, and that was back in the 50s, right?
Yeah, in 1950, exactly. So it was in May 1950.
So we're talking about long before technology was around for people to, do fake photographs, and you're talking about real film too.
Exactly, and Photoshop wasn't around back then.
Right.
And many people have asked if it could have been the case that they used a model, but it couldn't have been because the photographers used the surrounding objects as a point of reference. So they used the electric pole, they used everything, and it just couldn't have been a model either. So it was completely authentic. And Paul and Evelyn Trent, they were very humble people. They didn't have the money to create models. They didn't have the money to create a hoax. And apart from that, they didn't gain anything from this sighting. That's what's important to note, that if someone was going to create a hoax, they would do it for the money or the fame. But these guys, they didn't get anything. All they did get was harassment from people and from the police. That's all they get.
Right. And it's not like nowadays where, if you have some kind of video evidence, you might be able to get a movie deal or make money off of it. Back in the 1950s, people weren't worried about stuff like that. They didn't have stuff like that. So yeah, they had nothing to gain whatsoever. Yeah,
exactly. They had no motives to create a hoax of any kind.
And then in part two, you talk about crashes and landings, and a lot of people, because the Roswell crash is so famous, and then also Rendlesham Forest in Europe is also a famous crash or landing, but there are quite a few others as well. Yeah,
people overlook the Aurora crash. In the second part, I start off with the Aurora crash, and this crash, it happened in 1897. So this was basically one of the first reported not only UFO sightings, but UFO crashes. And this case, it's amazing how clear it is that there was a cover-up. So basically, in April of 1987, in Aurora, Texas, there was a judge who lived in a house, and he had a windmill on his property. And in the early hours of the morning, he hears a loud crash. And so do his neighbors. The word quickly starts going around that, found an alien body, and they found a UFO. And they did actually find an alien body. Well, I say that for the simple reason that the evidence tends to show that, basically. The evidence points towards that direction. Just the following day, in the newspaper, an author wrote basically that a funeral was held, a wake was held, and people paid their respects, because Texas, it's quite Christian. They held a funeral for the alien body, was recovered. And they also buried the body as well with the UFO fragments. And this is a very important point because years down the line, a century later, basically over a century later, the MUFON team, the Mutual UFO Network, they sent out investigators to the cemetery to examine the gravesite exactly. And they found that each time they put the metal detectors, it would go off. So each time they put the metal detectors over the grave, the metal detector would go off, indicating that there was some kind of metal buried in there. And naturally, they assumed that there was a UFO buried there. So they asked the Cemetery Association to grant them permission to exhume the grave. But not only did they deny them permission, denied them access, they even denied them further access to the cemetery altogether. So they were completely banned from entering the cemetery altogether. And the following day, they saw 2-inch pipes going in the grave, which means that someone had basically gone in the grave and done something with whatever was buried there. And not only that, but each time they placed the metal detector over the grave, it no longer went off. So they assumed that someone had misplaced the metallic fragments which were buried. And to me, this indicates that there is a cover-up, because firstly, if you have nothing to hide, then why would you not grant them permission to exhume the grave?
Right.
And secondly, what was buried in the grave that was misplaced? Why didn't the metal detector go off when it had gone off a day before? So in just one day, whatever was buried in the grave was placed elsewhere. And these are all signs that a cover-up was in place. To me, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, and it's odd that, like Roswell, the cover-up happened right then. And then with this case, it was when it got some attention from, in modern times from MUFON, and they started poking around and found out about it, that they came in and covered it up.
Exactly. In the 1890s, I doubt that the Air Force or any individual was too caught up in the idea of alien beings visiting our planet. But nowadays, we realize that it's not only a possibility, but it's actually happening. So it does make sense for the cover-up to be happening right now, as opposed to in the 1890s. And like you said, the Roswell cover-up, it happened there and then. In the same day, they released contradictory statements, and it was happening as the day progressed, I guess. And the thing about the Roswell case is that they had been seeing flying discs in the sky for 2 weeks before the crash even happened.
Yeah, and that's a point that a lot of people don't know. They think that just this thing crashed out of nowhere. But yeah, there was lots of reports of UFO sightings in the area.
Yeah, in fact, and the Roswell crash, it starts on the 14th of June. What many people think that the crash happened in July. And yes, it did happen in July. But the events start on the 14th of June of 1947. That's when Brazel, who is the rancher who found the flying disc, or the fragments of the flying disc, that is when he first noticed the debris. So he first noticed the debris on the 14th of June. But he had assumed that this was simply a weather balloon, because it wasn't the first time that he had recovered weather balloons from his ranch. But as the days went on and people started talking about a flying disc, and a flying disc which had crashed, he thought, could it be that maybe what I saw on my ranch was this flying disc that everyone is talking about? So he went back to the ranch and then took it to the sheriff's office, and the investigation initiated basically on that day. And from there on, the Air Force basically covered up the whole event. Some might say not well enough, because we all know how contradictory their claims were.
Right. And there's been quite a few of those claims. I just saw a case not so long ago where the swamp gas explanation came from, where they first started talking about swamp gases, and their explanations aren't that great. And that's probably, like you said, why the Roswell case is so prevalent, is because it's just the government's explanation just doesn't make any sense. And it's kind of just snowballed with a lot of the government denial, with like the Phoenix Lights even, and on up until today, where we maybe have some disclosure coming. But
yeah, we've come a long way, certainly. I mean, when we compare, for example, the Roswell case, the Air Force stated that what crashed at Roswell was a weather balloon. But just hours before that, they had stated that the US Air Force was in possession of a flying disc. And these statements were published on newspapers, basically. But nowadays, the Pentagon has come out and stated that the UFOs are real, and we've caught these UFOs on footage, on military footage. So I do think that we've come a long way, but there are certainly aspects which the government is not even acknowledging. I believe for good reason, because it's difficult for any government to come out and say, listen, we don't know anything about these beings. We just know that they are infinitely more superior to us. I believe if the government did say that, then it would create some sort of panic, and it would also the government would also lose all of its power and control. So I believe that disclosure will happen, but to an extent.
Yeah. And the Tic Tac video, as it's been called, has been making the rounds on the media, and the media has kind of gotten more serious about the UFO phenomena than just making fun of it.
Yeah. And that's what's amazing. These past years, in 2017, when the Tic Tac and gimbal footage were released, there was such a shift in how people view the UFO phenomenon. Before, it was around green little men and people in tinfoil hats. But now it's an actual topic which people are discussing. And it's only because they saw how powerful these aircrafts are. It's only because they saw how powerful these beings are. And those footages, maybe we're going to talk about them later on, they show so much, and there is so much information in that footage, which proves how advanced these beings are.
Speaking of military and government contact, the part 3 is a huge section of the book that you've got quite a few stories about the military's involvement with chasing these or getting them on radar, or this hard evidence, like you were saying about the radar. In the third part of the book, I discuss cases in which there was a full-blown response from the military. So cases which military jets were scrambled and chased UFOs. But also there are other circumstances in which the UFOs were doing the chasing, which was extremely interesting. There's my favorite incident is the Tehran incident. The Tehran case, it happened in 1976. And each time the military jet started approaching the UFO, the fighter jet would lose all of its communication with the base. And at one point, the fighter pilot even tried to launch a missile towards the UFO. But what happened instead was that in an instant, the jet lost all of its power and lost all of its communication with the Air Force base, which basically, I saw it as a sign of intimidation. I picture in my head that the fighter pilot realized that he is not the one who is in control of the airspace, right?
But these beings, and cases like this one prove just how powerful these beings are. Not only do they defy the laws of physics, but they can also manipulate our technology and our aircraft. Because in this case, the fighter jet lost all of its power in an instant, and to me that's just mind blowing. And it's so dangerous as well when you think about it, because it proves that the technology we have just doesn't match up to what they have.
Yeah, and there's also been other stories, quite a few of them, about UFO craft hovering over nuclear power plants and shutting them down.
Yeah, and many people have come up with their own conclusions about why that is. I believe that it is because they are monitoring our activity. But there have been numerous instances in which UFOs, like you said, have been seen hovering above nuclear storage sites, including the Rendlesham Forest. The Rendlesham Forest, which is a famous UFO case which happened in England. A few days before the actual sighting, the UFO was seen hovering above the nuclear storage site, which is underground, the Air Force Base. That's a fact that not many people know. Underneath the Rendlesham Air Force Base, there was a storage site, the second biggest storage site in Europe at that time. And they stored missile silos, basically, and the UFOs were seen hovering above it. But apart from the Rendlesham Forest, there have been other instances in which UFOs were seen hovering above nuclear storage sites. My favorite incident was when the UFO disabled all 50 missiles. And so basically 1/3 of America's nuclear arsenal was disabled by a UFO. It's just not it couldn't be a coincidence. Definitely not.
Right. With that being said, do you think that's just from your research, do you think that's a show of power from the extraterrestrials saying, hey, we can do this? Or is it some kind of message that we need to stop doing some of the things we're doing?
I think it's both. So this is definitely a way of extraterrestrial beings proving to us that we're not in control here. I think that we can all agree that nuclear missiles are the most dangerous arsenal that we have. I mean, we can literally destroy other nations with these weapons. But when a UFO is seen hovering above a nuclear storage site and all the missiles are disabled, that to me shows how futile our technology is and how futile our weapons are. But on top of that, I also think that it is a case in which these beings are monitoring our activity. Because at the end of the day, if a nuclear war were to start, it would also affect other planets, other galaxies. So yeah, I think it's definitely both.
You have one story in here about President Carter having a sighting.
Yeah.
But I've heard stories here recently, and there was another researcher who wrote a book recently about President Eisenhower possibly having contact and kind of making a deal with UFOs.
Yeah, I think when you make a claim like that, when you state that, listen, the president is making deals with ET beings, I think that's a very big claim. And right. Carl Sagan himself stated, listen, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So I don't know how much evidence there is to support that claim. And like President Carter's sighting is a definite proof that it is ET in nature. I mean, not necessarily. It is quite a case in which doesn't have a lot of information. It could be ET in nature, and the details which we have do tend to point towards that direction. But I myself cannot state that it's 100% is the case that the UFO which President Carter saw was UFO in nature, because there isn't that much evidence.
Yeah. It's easy to think that with especially the U.S. government's covered up of UFOs throughout the years, that the presidents have to be somehow involved. I know they're more of a figurehead for the most part of the state, but they have to be somehow involved with the cover up and at least know something.
Well, I think there is information which they do have access to, but also other information which they do not have access to. I don't believe that the president knows about. I don't think that the president knows all the information there is about UFOs. I think it's more about knowing surface level details.
Right.
Because here's the thing, I don't think that the CIA or the Air Force or whoever really is in charge of this information would trust a single person with this highly classified information, because it naturally affects the entire world at the end of the day.
Yeah, and when you hear a lot of reports, like firsthand accounts from people who have claimed to have been, worked at Area 51 or any of these other places, these other military bases, they always talk about it's very segmented about how much they were told, and they kind of keep it segmented. Yeah, it's compartmentalized. This information is compartmentalized. And if we talk about Bob Lazar for a second, and that's exactly what he said, that the information which he had was only pertaining to what he was working on. So he was working on reverse engineering a UFO craft, but he didn't have information about the UFO beings or any other information in reality, because it's compartmentalized and it's completely classified. It's highly classified. So even if you do work at Area 51, for instance, you wouldn't have all the information about ET technology or UFOs. Yeah, you would just have the one part that they had you working on, and that would be all you would know about what's going on.
Yeah, that would be it. It's all on a need-to-know basis, essentially.
Yeah, and then like we had alluded to earlier with the government projects in part 4 of your book, a lot of people have heard about Project Blue Book, but there's been quite a few others as well that are kind of a little more hush-hush and you don't really hear about.
Yeah, for instance, Project Grudge and the Condon Committee and ATIP. I think ATIP, it's more recent years, and I think that is perhaps the only government project which gave us some sort of answers. But apart from Project ATIP, if we look at Project Sign or Project Grudge, they all gave us the same result, all the same explanation. For instance, Project Grudge stated that the UFOs which were seen they don't have advanced technology, nor do they pose a threat to national security, which is an outright lie, because if you ask me, if an object which we cannot identify, nor do we know the intentions of it, if this object infiltrates national airspace, to me that poses a threat to national security.
Right.
And the Grudge report goes on to state that each and every UFO report is a result of a hoax or psychopathological people. So he's blaming it. He's basically stigmatizing the phenomenon altogether. He's stating only people who are psychopathological in nature have reported UFOs. So it basically makes the normal person say, listen, if I see a UFO, it means that I'm suffering from a mental health disorder of some sort, which is a way of the government trying to push this propaganda, a way for the government to make people not report UFO sightings. But thankfully, over the years, if we look at Project ATIP, it was initiated in 2007 up until, well, the government came out and stated in 2017 that Project ATIP existed. Lou Elizondo, who was the director of the project, he stated that they were given $20 million. They had a budget of $20 million. And they found out that the government is in possession of metal alloys, which is extraterrestrial in origin. He stated that this metal could not have come from Russia or China or any other advanced country. It was extraterrestrial in origin. Now, what that means, I don't know. But to me, the fact that a government personnel such as Lou Elizondo came out and said, listen, we have ET metal in our possession, to me, that's such a big deal.
Yeah, because that alludes to some sort of contact, whether it be the crash at Roswell or some of these other landings or crashes, or by other means that our government came to get those materials.
Yeah, exactly. And they had to get it from somewhere. Now, is this metal that came from Roswell, New Mexico? Is it metal that came from any other crashes? Nobody knows in reality, but the fact that it is extraterrestrial in origin, to me, that's such a big deal. And I'm really glad that we're moving towards not disclosure to an extent, but having an open discussion about the phenomenon and getting more answers from the government and the Air Force.
Yeah, and there were a report with Roswell. The reason I said Roswell is because there were reports with Roswell that there was a type of metal that they could crumple up, but it was like a memory metal, and you couldn't destroy it. You couldn't do anything to it.
Yeah, and this metal, so like you said, they could bend it and it would return to its original shape. They couldn't set it on fire. They couldn't scratch it or tear it. It was like aluminium foil, but it completely returned to its original shape. And if we look at all the metals which we have on Earth, they have a melting point to an extent, but this metal just couldn't be lit on fire. All the characteristics do not match up with any metals which we have on Earth. So if these statements from the witness reports are factual and are true, then this does allude to the fact that the metal was ET in nature. And this maybe corroborates Lou Elizondo's claim that they are in possession of ET metal as well.
So with a lot of the government reports that have come out recently, and then also in the past, I'm sure the government has, especially the U.S. government, has participated in misinformation too. So what do you think is the best way as a UFO researcher? How do you delineate between what is, very factual as far as what comes to our government and what is disinformation that they're putting out, kind of like smoke and mirrors?
Yeah, and that is such an important question because it's important to distinguish a UFO report from a hoax or from a smoking mirror, like you said. And this is why I promote people to do their own investigating. If you investigate the case yourself, then you're closer to coming to an answer than if you look up online, to a degree, of course. So when it came to researching UFO cases, I kept 5 characteristics in mind. And these are known as the top 5 observables of UFOs. So if a UFO sighting contains any of the following 5 characteristics, then it could be the case that it is ET in origin. So the first characteristic, it would be anti-gravity propulsion system. So if the aircraft doesn't have visible flight characteristics such as wings or exhaust plumes, then it means that it possesses anti-gravity propulsion system. Secondly, we have to look at the movements of the UFO. Is it making any sudden and instantaneous acceleration? If that is the case, then it could be ET in nature, because as with every vehicle on Earth, the human body can only withstand a certain amount of G-forces. When we look at cases in which a UFO has traveled 3,600 miles an hour, for example, like the Tic Tac UFO, the human body could not withstand that pressure. So that's another factor which could prove that the UFO is ET in origin. The third characteristic would be the sonic boom. Naturally, when an aircraft or any vehicle exceeds the speed of sound and breaks the sound barrier, it produces a sonic boom. However, over the cases, we've seen that when the UFO exceeds the speed of sound, the sonic boom is not heard, which means that the UFO is traveling through a vacuum, which is practically impossible for any aircraft. And lastly, the last characteristic, I refer to it as transmedium traveling, which means that the UFO is able to travel through multiple mediums, such as the atmosphere, the ocean, and space, outer space, that is. So if any UFO case contains any of these 5 characteristics, to me that is an indication that it could be ET in origin. So that's what people should look out for, these 5 characteristics.
And we've been kind of alluding to the Tic Tac video, and for people that hadn't seen it, it's a video from a fighter jet, a U.S. fighter jet, of this object that the pilots don't know what it is, and their camera is following it, and it's just jumping from one place to another, and it's going way faster than humanly possible, anything that we have.
Yeah. What's interesting about the Tic Tac is that not only did it exceed the speed of sound and outmaneuvered the fighter jets, but it also outmaneuvered the fastest submarine the U.S. Navy is in possession of, because at one point the Tic Tac goes underwater and it travels at 70 knots, which is double the speed the fastest submarine could travel at. So it's not only outmaneuvered the fastest, or one of the faster rather, Navy fighter jets, but it also outpaced the Navy's fastest submarine.
We kind of danced around this, but I wanted to ask this question. All the stories that you researched and all the evidence that you've compiled, do you think that that the UFOs are hostile, or do you think they're friendly and at some point in time they will initiate contact? Yeah,
that's a very interesting question, because there's evidence for both sides of the coin. So are they hostile in nature? They could be, because there are cases in which the UFOs were hostile in nature. People have lost their lives when chasing UFOs. For example, Frederick Valentik, Felix Moncla, and Watson, they all lost their lives as they were chasing a UFO. Felix Moncla and Robert Wilson, they disappeared as they were chasing a UFO. They literally just lost contact, and they were never to be seen again. It's the same with Frederick Valentik. He lost his life as he was chasing a UFO. So, do these beings have malicious intentions? I would say some of them do. When we look at humans, we don't simply generalize every human being. There are good people and there are bad people. There are people who have good intentions and people who have bad intentions. And I think it's the same with ETs as well. I think there are beings who possess malicious intentions and beings who quite particularly don't have bad intentions. So yes, there are beings who have shown that they have malicious intentions. Yes, definitely.
And the U.S. government, like we've been saying, have disclosed quite a bit. And they don't do it in an easy way, because I know they do big document dumps because of Freedom of Information Acts and stuff like that. People have to wade through them, and it's still a lot of redacted stuff. But why do you think other governments have kind of stayed silent, even with the U.S. kind of leading the way with saying, hey, we have these videos and we don't know what they are?
Yeah, I guess the U.S. has this fantasy that they lead the world, and that any information which people should know, it has to come from them. But from my research, I've seen that other governments are way more open about the phenomenon than the US is. For example, Brazil, in 1986, there was a night in which several UFOs were observed and military fighter jets were scrambled. The following day, the Air Force conducted a press conference in which they stated that the UFOs were real. They weren't military jets, and they did not know what they were. So there was this complete transparency on their behalf. Did they say that they were ET in origin? No, because they couldn't prove that. But they did say that they weren't military. So there is a distinction between the way the US Air Force approaches UFOs and the way other governments approach UFOs. In this case, it's Brazil.
So that just with the U.S. government, it's more of because we haven't heard it from them until now. That's why it's a surprise. But around the world, there has been disclosure, and it's just not been as, I guess, the media hasn't picked up on it, so it's not been as worldwide.
Yeah, exactly. And in my opinion, there is this certain element of power which the US government loves to have
Right.
to an extent. So if they came out and stated that UFOs exist and we have no power over them and we have no idea who these beings are, they would naturally lose some of that power. They would lose some of that control. So the approach is most certainly different. I would say that, yeah.
With all of this stuff coming out, do you think we're going to see more disclosure, more revelations about what we know about these and what we don't?
And here's the thing, and this is what I tell everyone. Disclosure is happening if you look at the right information. I mean, if you look at the information I included in this book, there is enough evidence to show that ETs exist. They have visited Earth, they always have, and there's proof for that. But if we're waiting around for the government to come out and say extraterrestrial beings are basically visiting our national airspace, we have no control over them, I don't think that will happen. But like I said, if you do your own research and look at the information which there is available out there, you will realize that there is no need to wait for the government to come out and say that, because the information is out there and it does prove that ETs exist and it does prove that they are visiting our planet.
Yeah, I think the U.S. government just takes center stage with it because of the disinformation throughout the years, and I think people look to that because maybe our government has answers that we don't. I think it's a big thing. But like you're saying, I think there's plenty of evidence out there, especially in the past 2 or 3 years. There's lots of people who are going through this document dumps and pulling out the best parts of the information.
Exactly. And when I first started writing this book 3 years ago, I saw such a shift because 5 years ago, there wasn't this openness to the topic which there is now. So as I started writing this book, I realized that more people are open to it. Many media outlets are covering the topic. So as we're advancing, many people are becoming more interested in the subject, which is a good thing, naturally. But like I said, there's plenty of information out there, and there are plenty of documents. In my book, I make reference to all the documents which I used and where you can access these documents. And the evidence is genuinely there. There is so much evidence in these documents. All you have to do is just look for it.
Yeah, I love the way you put together the book, like I was saying, and I very much enjoyed the book, and I will definitely keep it. I'm lucky on this show, for full disclosure.
Yeah.
A lot of publishers send me books, and I actually got yours before it came out, because your book just came out March 8th.
Yeah, it just came out on the 8th of March, yeah.
Yeah, so, but yeah, I would urge people to go out. It's available on Kindle, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can get it anywhere you can find books, and I would recommend going out and getting it. Where can they find you if they want to connect with you and see more stuff you have going on?
You can find me on Facebook. I'm always open to talking to anyone who wants to talk about the phenomenon. And if you want to make contact with me via email, I'm always happy to reply to emails. My email is wagius67@gmail.com. So yeah, that's where you can find me. I'm always open to talk to people about the phenomenon, and I'm always happy to listen to what everyone has to say about it.
And I'll put links to your book and your Facebook and all that stuff in the show notes. People can go find those there.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I know this book just came out, but are you working on any future projects that you'd like to share?
Yes. So right now, I'm still in the early process of working on the second book. So I'm hoping that with each book, we delve deeper into the topic. There isn't much which I can say right now because it's still in the early stages of it. But I definitely will keep talking about the phenomenon. I will definitely keep publishing stuff. So yeah, keep an eye out for that.
All right. Well, I thank you so much, Warren, for coming on today and talking with us. I've enjoyed the conversation immensely.
Thank you for having me.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. And as always, stay safe out there. Have a good day. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or at our website, unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And don't forget to like, review, rate, and share with all your friends. Thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. Listen to our theme song and more of his music at chrislipsmusic.com. And remember, some of the scariest things are unseen.